Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online lecture series for Bio 2. Today, we wrap up our entire tree of life by trying to put a timeline to these events. Because thus far, we spent a lot of time going over all of the diversity on planet Earth, and at some points, we've tried to anchor things in terms of a timeline. But I think it might be helpful, now that you have the entire picture of the tree of life, to take a look at how things changed chronologically rather than evolutionarily. So we can visualize this timeline in a number of different ways. This timeline, taken from Wikipedia, can be quite helpful. It shows you from Earth's inception, about 4.5 billion years ago. We see first Earth, water arising shortly thereafter, first single-celled life. Then we see the evolution of photosynthesis, something like 3 billion years ago. We start seeing atmospheric oxygen and the oxygen crisis, where oxygen changes so much. We see the evolution of eukaryotes just about 2 billion years ago. Some of the earliest fungi, 1.5 billion years ago. We start seeing sexual reproduction, so who knew? Sex is fairly new. Just over a billion years ago. We see our first plants under 1 billion years ago. Our first animals shortly thereafter. So these are multicellular organisms. And then we have the Cambrian explosion. And so much of what we talked about in our tree of life only covers this recent 540 million year period from the Cambrian explosion to today. So know that when we're talking about the evolutionary history of Earth, we are covering just a small sliver of it when we discuss biodiversity of multicellular organisms. Now, I don't want to diminish how much has occurred in the recent past because there has been so much, but I do at least want you to be aware of the fact that Earth has been around a long time, and life, multicellular life, life on land, and all the trappings there attached are fairly new. You also have another image in your textbook, in Appendix B, about the geological time frame of Earth, showing again when prokaryotes arose, our first eukaryotes, some other notable events, the Cambrian explosion, first vertebrates on land, the era of the dinosaurs, and then the fact that we, the first hominids, are relatively new on planet Earth within the last 2 million years. So we generally ignore the time period from 4.6 billion to the Cambrian explosion, and our class is really focused on these three eras. And that is what they are, the eras of Earth's history. The Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. The old time, the middle time, and the newest time. Now, each of these have their own individual subcategories, like you may have heard of the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Jurassic, the Triassic. Those I'll leave for a future class in terms of understanding. If you walk away with an understanding of the major differences between the Paleo, Meso, and Cenozoic in this introductory Bio 2 class, I'll be very happy. So just as a broad rule of thumb, I like to try to introduce some of the major changes that have happened in each of these different eras. They are separated by major extinction events, which we won't spend much time talking about, but at least know that these time points are punctuated through mass extinctions. The Paleozoic is when we first see a lot of life developing, lots of multicellular life. So we see plants coming onto land. We see animals following them. Those first early plants go from things like moss, all the way to our lycophytes, ferns, and conifers. The gymnosperm-bearing plants, lots of seed ferns are very popular in this time period because the Paleozoic is a fairly wet time period. This era holds the Carboniferous within it. So it's that time period where the earth was very swampy, tons and tons of plant life that was not decaying, that was not breaking down, therefore creating modern reserves of oil underground. In terms of the animals in the Paleozoic, we're looking at a lot of different aquatic life diversifying during this time period and before. And then we have our first tetrapods on land. But those tetrapods are largely amphibians. The group that does incredibly well during this swampy Earth Paleozoic are our insects and lots of other invertebrates. Then we have a punctuated extinction event. Something like 250 million years ago, there's a large extinction event that then clears off something like 90+% of all aquatic life and does damage to a lot of the terrestrial life as well. But this mass extinction then clears up space for a lot of evolutionary innovation. And in our Mesozoic era, we see the dominance of our dinosaurs. Lots of different lineages in those three different periods, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. But dinosaurs were, for the most part, were making up a vast majority of our macrofauna, large animals. On the plant side of things, we get a lot of conifer forests. The eras of the ferns and the horsetails have kind of died down, with pines largely pines arising during this era and taking over. And then later on in this time period, we get the first angiosperms. However, note that during this time period that we're getting dinosaurs dominating, we of course still have, or of course have mammals concurrent with these dinosaurs, but they're not mammals like you and I. They're instead much smaller. And there's a lot of action happening in the insect world, lots in the invertebrate world. They change as well. Something like 66 million years ago, 65 million years ago, we have the extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous that leads us into the Cenozoic, the modern time period. Well, that's a really weird why. In the modern time period, we start seeing a lot of angiosperms taking over, in particular, the dominance of grasslands. Grass evolves during this time, and we see the expansion of prairies and a lot of different animals associated with that, as a lot of the grasses provide a lot more nutritious, nutriently rich and calorically rich foods. So from there we see a lot of smaller but still large mammals, so large numbers of these mammals. On the animal side of things, mammals come to dominate. They've taken over the niche of the dinosaurs being the macrofauna, and more recently, within the last 6 million years, we start seeing things that resemble humans. Up until very, very recently, we have our direct ancestors. The first, from hominins to hominids to humans. So this kind of paints a broad brush picture of what Earth was looking like during each of these major eras. from the time period of 541 million years to 250 million years. We were largely a swampy planet. That's not to say that at times, things did not change and there's more frost and or drier time periods. Climate change and um, environmental shifts are something fairly consistent in our past. But looking at the overall life forms, we see a lot of ferns and conifers and those kind of swampier specialist plants in the Paleozoic with a large abundance of different insects and amphibians and a huge diversity of aquatic organisms. In the Mesozoic, the dinosaurs reign supreme while conifer forests take over the planet and angiosperms start to evolve under the radar. In the Cenozoic, the angiosperms take over, particularly grasses, producing so many broad grasslands. And alongside these grasses and the other forests that have been expanding, the flowering tree forests, we see a huge diversity of different mammal groups. So how does this look like on the tree of life? Well, I want to do a similar analysis of time across the tree of life to show you that so much is changing throughout the tree as time advances. It's not like all of the evolution in one lineage. It's not like all of the insects and all of the invertebrates, all of the protostomes do all of their evolution in one time and then they're done. These things are happening in parallel all of the time. To this day, we are still seeing massive changes in parallel throughout the diversity of life. And so, in studying how these changes happen through time, we'll first start by looking back at that 541 million years ago Cambrian explosion to the first major change that occurred at these blue stars across the tree of life. So we see both in the protostome and deuterostome lineages that most of the oceanic lineages have started at about 535 million years ago. This means that the organisms that would go on to form your chordates in water have started about 535 million years ago. A lot of your lineages that would form so much of your invertebrate diversity. In here, I'm talking about things like, the ancestors of your crustaceans, your mollusks, your brachiopods. All of the aquatic lineages got their start 535 million years ago. Now, at the same time, or rather, quite a bit later, we see the first tetrapod lineages arising about 390 million years ago and making their first steps on land. So it would take a while before a lot of the vast diversity of tetrapods started to explore the land. From 535 million years ago to 390, we got this change that would go from the vertebrates aquatically all the way to the first groups of organisms that would eventually become things like Tiktaalik, the transition from aquatic to land reproduction in tetrapods. Now, there is a large series of big changes that happened at these pink stars 363 million years ago. We have the origin of sharks at about this time. Oops, let me go ahead and add the million years ago. So when we say that sharks are ancient, we mean that sharks are ancient. They've been around for an incredible amount of time and have dominated the oceans for so long. At the same time that we start seeing sharks, we also see insects come up on land, and shortly thereafter we see them flying. We see ferns start to dominate or start to expand 363 million years ago. It would not take them very long to start dominating the land and being the major flora that covers the earth. And at the same 363 million year ago time point, we also see evolution in our crustaceans. Crabs first arise. Kind of cool, I think. Now, there are other changes that will occur through time, but of course this 363 and beyond is our Carboniferous, and so we see a lot of the same swampy organisms, diversity happening in those lineages. Before 280 million years ago, we see our first seeds, cone-bearing plants, and beetles majorly diversifying and really taking over from there. They would dominate the landscape up until 251 million years ago, where there was this mass marine extinction that took something like 30 million years to recover from. Now, shortly thereafter this extinction, we see the first frogs appear. Another 5 million years after that, we have our first aquatic dinosaurs. And another 25 million years after that, we have the first fly. So there's massive diversification, stuff that you might begin to recognize, frogs and flies. I will note here that frogs evolved first, the true fly as we know it today, much, much later, with beetles predating our flies. Kind of cool, huh? Oh, I forgot to mention something. This has been covered in lecture, so I wanted to mention it again here. But we got that split between the synapsids and the lineage that would lead to all of the reptiles, the diapsids, somewhere between 320 and 300 million years ago. Now, at the same time that this split was happening, octopi first arose on the scene. It's kind of interesting, I think. So, from there, it would be a large diversity, or a lot of diversity happening in a hugely diverse number of lineages. So we have this bubble to go over here. So after that 220 million year ago time point where we see the evolution of flies, we then start seeing 176 million years ago our first stegosaurs. So those are the big spined dinosaurs that I think a lot of folks recognize. We see our first eutherians, so true beasts, true mammals, arising 160 million years ago, but again, they would have been very, very small. The fossil of Archaeopteryx dates back something like 155 million years ago, so it's possible that our first bird lineages would have diversified then. And then at the same time that the birds are happening, we see our first pine pollen occurring 153 million years ago. So pine trees, as we know them today, arose 153, or similarly to how we recognize them today, arose 153 million years ago. Now this evolutionary dominance of dinosaurs and dominance of pines on land continued to experience further change. 125 million years ago, we see our first flowering plants, and about 25 million years after that, we see the evolution of bees. So you see kind of how, in several of these changes, how the evolution of one major new innovation, oftentimes in plants, leads to an evolutionary change in some of the animals. These systems of coevolution over long time periods. As flowering plants change so much about pollination, so much about food availability, we start to see new lineages of insects that can specialize on this new lineage of plants, and this kind of race together, cooperative race, to diversify and occupy new niches across our environments. 95 million years ago, we have the crocodilians as we'd recognize them. So keep in mind that the crocodiles are today the closest living relatives of birds. That's a yikes. Because the pterosaurs and all of the other dinosaur lineages that have gone extinct. But crocodiles are also ancient. But when we talk about ancient organisms, crocodiles are about 100 million years old. Sharks go back 363 million years. So when you're comparing these things, know that yes, they are both ancient, but know that there's still a long time period between them. They may have been around for a while, they may continue to have evolved for a while, but crocodiles are much, much newer than sharks. Now, of course, this evolutionary bout would continue in the dinosaur era with our first T-Rex fossil found dated to 68 million years ago, and at about the same time we see the lineage of Triceratops on planet Earth. So T-Rex was, fortunately or unfortunately, a short-lived species, even though it was fairly dominant and big. But of course, we then got our 66 million years ago, 65 million years ago, extinction event between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary, the KT boundary. After the KT boundary, we start seeing mammals, ants. That's weird to think about. Ants. There's evolution happening in our insect lineages while all of this crazy macrofauna change is happening. Rodents, penguins start to diversify immediately after the extinction event. And then at high latitudes, we see conifers and ginkgo forests be the first forests that mammals are thriving in. So it's weird to think about, but really ginkgo forests may have been some of the first forests that our mammal ancestors would have explored. Now, as things get a little bit more close to us, there's a lot of changes that you may be familiar with. So again, I've only selected a handful. There's so much more scientific literature out there as to when all of these changes are happening, so I'd encourage you to go look into them. But let's just take a handful of things that I found interesting. So 55 million years ago, we get modern birds. So all the modern bird lineages arise. And 40 million years ago, we have butterflies. 38 million years ago, the first bear lineages occur. So, wow, bears are kind of old, but not as old as butterflies. Interesting to think that the true modern butterflies are only 40 million years ago, but we see patterns that of related butterfly species dating back before even flowering plants were a thing. So again, these are kind of more specific to things that you would immediately recognize as a butterfly. Now, 38 million years ago, bear. 35 million years ago, the grasses began to dominate the planet. So large diversification of grasses. 10 million years after that, we saw the first deer, which of course make up a hugely important food staple in our area. Quite tasty as well. And then 9.5 million years ago, North and South America got close enough to exchange a lot of species. So things that used to be South American specialists started to migrate up north, and things that used to be North American specialists migrated down south. So I included this little bullet point to point out the fact that the entire time that we're getting so much diversification of animals across the planet, the continents are also moving, allowing for independent little laboratories of evolution on each of the isolated continents, preventing gene flow between species or once upon a time connected groups, now allowing for them to diversify and here, 10 million years ago, reconnect. To round out our quick sprint through time, we see that 6.5 million years ago, the first hominins, so things related to humans, arose. And just about 1 million years ago, we get our first coyotes, which I find quite interesting. And then, of course, on the thousands of years ago scale, we have our first Homo sapiens. And then sometime between the last 30,000 and 15,000 years ago, we get the second most important species on the planet, the first domesticated dog. So there's a lot going on in the tree of life throughout time. I don't expect you to have these dates memorized. You can always look these up. And they might change through time. What I want you to get out of this lecture is to understand that these are many parallel lines of life, adapting to similar climates similar changes in climate throughout time. The dominance of one lineage is a temporary thing. Diversity of life has been a constant throughout our earthly history. Whether we're talking about diversity within the plants, which now are just a small portion of the tree because we ended with our mammals, or whether we're talking about the diversity of the invertebrates or the vertebrates, and whether that be the reptile variety or the mammal variety. So much is changing, and who knows what might come next. But I do hope that this quick sprint through the evolutionary history of the planet, with an attempt of understanding the timeline of things, puts into better perspective how old some of these different groups of animals and plants that we talked about have been. And in particular, when you're at a museum the next time or visiting a botanic garden and you see a placard that talks to you about the Paleozoic or the Mesozoic or the Cenozoic, you now have a frame of reference with which to understand these massive geological timescale changes and the corresponding changes in the diversity of flora and fauna on planet Earth.